It was in the midst of all this that Sutton got a clear picture of the financial situation and wrote out a lengthy email outlining it to Driscoll and Dave Bruskus. By that time, the three of them made up the executive team and would until the closing of the church. Several things were making the church financially unsustainable, but there was one big issue at the root.
I coined it the Hail Mary strategy. So what happened is you charge up a year's worth of expenses, and then November and December, you have to have a year-end giving that is a Hail Mary to bring the books back to even. And what happened is every single year the spending was more and more and more, that the Hail Mary became, it's like in football, you can ask a quarterback from, like the 40-yard line, their own 40-yard line to do a Hail Mary. But if you're on the 25 or the 10, their own 10, you can't throw a Hail Mary pass. You can't throw it that far. Well, that's where the church was getting.
In other words, they weren't just dependent on big year-end gifts for their budget. That's not terribly unique for nonprofits. They were growing more dependent on them year over year in a way that was unsustainable. Sutton also identified patterns of reckless spending and concerns over the way leaders were leveraging the church to build personal platforms. Several people familiar with the ministries at this time, though, noted that both of these issues had a model in Driscoll himself, and that he'd directed certain staff to build platforms as a way to extend the Mars Hill brand. Nonetheless, this moment was a tipping point, and the executive team agreed to empower Sutton to make significant changes to the way money was budgeted and spent. Those would be felt down the line in the years to come. That same month, the controversy with McDonald and the Elephant Room grew noisy enough that Driscoll decided to resign from the Gospel Coalition as well. And in bigger news than that, hand over the keys of Acts 29 to Matt Chandler. One could read those circumstances as Driscoll backing down and caving to pressure. But I actually think that it was in line with the reorganization that was happening at Mars Hill at the time, that they were narrowing their focus on growing the church and pushing towards their ultimate goal of 50 locations and 50,000 people. Sutton's one-year anniversary on the staff was shortly after all of this.
Mark comes in to my review, and Dave and I got a shovel from Mark. A shovel that Mark put Proverbs 14:4, which says, "Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but the abundance of crops come by the strength of the ox." Basically meaning that I'm going to have to walk around behind Mark and clean up his poop, to put it nicely. And so that was, that's my anniversary.
Sutton also coordinated a shift in the bylaws at this time. The governing board of the church was made up of staff members, all of whom reported to Mark in some way, and who had very little incentive to hold him accountable.
Everybody that's on that board looks at Mark as a spiritual father, agrees with everything that Mark is doing, and so there's no accountability. And so I'm starting to try to figure out, okay, so who will Mark be? I asked the question. So Mark, who would you be accountable to? And I'm thinking Piper. I'm thinking Tim Keller. I'm thinking like the top, the people across the country that maybe Mark would listen to. And he says to me, "I'm not going to be accountable to anybody with a smaller church." And man, you know what? Looking back on that, I should have realized, wait a minute, Mark's the problem. The board governance is not the problem. Mark's the problem, but I didn't.
The board that was installed included a couple of well-respected business leaders from the church, Larry Osborne, pastor of North Coast Church, and James McDonald. When that was all said and done, the new board distributed another round of symbolic gifts, and they were prophetic for the years to come.
I get a hard hat because what they tell me, you've got a really hard job, and you're going to need this. And then they give Mark a lunch pail, and that lunch pail, Michael Van Skyke says, who's the chairman, says, "This needs to be the last lunch you pack, Mark."
Maybe this colloquialism's a little more familiar to some of you than it was to me, but to pack somebody's lunch is basically to dress them down, to get in their face, to yell at them, and humiliate them.
Mark actually signed it for me and gave me the lunch pail because I'm going to pack everybody's lunch. And then Dave gets a bullhorn, like the ones that firemen use, and the board tells Dave, you need to get a voice, meaning Mark needs to no longer be the guy telling bad things to people. You need to be the guy telling the hard and having the hard conversation.
In some ways, this whole thing is telling, because it's clear they wanted to insulate Mark from conflict. So make Sutton the hatchet man. Make Dave the one that goes and has hard conversations. And keep Driscoll at a distance when you can. All this change was destabilizing the organization, though.